It is indeed a privilege and an honor to be here, to have been given the opportunity to deliver the 14th Netaji Subhash Memorial Lecture. So let me begin by, of course, thanking the Netaji Subhash Bose INA Memorial Trust for providing me this opportunity. Let me also thank FICCI for providing this fantastic venue for this lecture. Now, as many of you already know, I have been arguing for many years now that India needs to begin to revisit its own history and begins to retell it. And what better place to start than by starting with the story of India's freedom struggle. The reason is that if you read the conventional, official history books, you will get the impression that India's freedom struggle was a uniquely peaceful one. Basically, we gently suggested to the British that they should leave, and they politely left. The problem is that there is a completely different story to be told about an armed resistance to the British going back over a long period of time. And this story too needs to be told. This is not to suggest that the non-violent movement did not play a role, it did. But there was an armed resistance too. And that story was just as important, but unfortunately, sadly, rubbed out of the usual narrative. Now, of course, many of the characters who were involved in this armed resistance have not yet been forgotten. These events are, after all, within living memory. So people are still aware of the names of Raj Bihari Bose or Bhagat Singh or Bismil and so on. But you'll get the impression that these were all individual acts of bravery that really didn't add up to a movement. So even the story of Netaji and the story of the INA comes up as if it was a flash in the pan that really didn't add up to very much. So what I'm going to try and do today is to give you a flavor of the other story. Now, I'm not going to focus on particularly the INA or on Netaji, because I'm sure they have been revisited in previous lectures. And to some extent, this story has been told more than others. But what has not been done, I feel, and I'm going to try and attempt this in this lecture, is to try and give you a flavor of the fact that this INA episode was a part of a much longer story. And if you do not understand that longer story, you will not understand what it is that Netaji and the INA were attempting to do, who the characters who were involved in this whole episode were, and what was the ultimate impact of this effort. So here goes. If you went back to the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, you have to remember that India had now been under solid British rule for quite some period. The last real threat to British rule had been the revolt of 1857, and that of course had been an armed revolt, but it had been entirely crushed. And although there had been certain episodes of resistance, for example, in what is now Jharkhand under Birsa Munda, or the nobility of Manipur, many people forget this, who had carried out perhaps the last real effort in the 1880s and 1890s to push back the British, those efforts had not really gone anywhere. So by the turn of the century, a new movement, a completely new episode of resistance began to emerge. Now the background to this was the fact that, of course, in the previous couple of decades, a institution, the Indian National Congress, had come together. But at least in the initial years, it was not much more than a debating society. In fact, the British tended to encourage the Congress because they thought of it as a safety valve. But it was really with the emergence of what is now known as the Garam Dal, the Lal Bal Pal trio, that you began to see a much more aggressive approach being taken towards demanding for full freedom from the British. So it is in this context that a few young men began to organize themselves. And the names that will now come up is the names of Savarkar and Sri Aurobindo. Now, Sri Aurobindo is today remembered as spiritual leader, but in the 1900s, his contribution was really to begin to organize groups, along with his brother Barin Ghosh, of groups across India, but particularly in Bengal, to resist British rule by creating a network of small cells, which would come under the rubric of the Anushilan Samiti. So, meanwhile, while he was creating this network of groups, incidentally, he was based at that time in Baroda, but this network was being created across Bengal. You also had young Indian students studying abroad, but particularly in London, who were organizing themselves in you can call it a student hostel accommodation called India House in London, under another bright young man called Veer Savarkar. Now, these very initial efforts at some level were maybe very young people getting together, almost amateurish, you could argue. But these were very important efforts, because they did two important things. One is that both Savarkar and Sri Aurobindo managed to create a network, and you will see, as I will come to later, that these networks became very important within India. And interestingly, with the case of Savarkar, he was based in London, but he was in touch with groups in North America, later on to become the Gatherites, in Paris, with the groups Shamji Verma and of course Bhikaji Kama. So there were all these groups that were bubbling around in this early part of the 20th century. Now, the very first attempt, this attempt that I am describing, however, unraveled very, very suddenly between 1908 and 1910. What happened is that Barin Ghosh had a ammunition factory just north of Kolkata in a place called Maniktala, and it got raided. Many of the characters involved in that episode of the Anushilan Samiti were arrested. Barin Ghosh himself was sent off to Kalapani, and Aurobindo Ghosh had to escape to Pondicherry. Similarly, in the case of Savarkar, with the assassination in London of Curzon Wiley by one of Savarkar's followers, meant that Savarkar himself was arrested, and despite his attempt to escape in Marseille, he ended up also in Kalapani, in the Port Blaise. Now, this episode, as I said, may appear to have been a bit of a waste, but it did establish, as I said, one network, but a very important other thing as well, which was the strategy. You see, Savarkar, although later on he would drift away from the revolutionary movement, he wrote a very important book on the revolt of 1857, which was smuggled into India and widely published later on. And in that book, he basically argued that 1857 was really a trial run for what he considered was the ultimate way in which India would get freedom, which was through a major revolt in the Indian armed forces who had remained loyal to the British. Now, this is very important because this idea that Savarkar put into the revolutionary movement would remain with it over the next half century. Now, by 1913, of course, the First World War started. And the remaining revolutionaries decided that this was the opportunity to operationalize this idea of causing a revolt. Now, within India, this was put together by a gentleman called Rash Bihari Bose and his lieutenant Sachindranath Sanyal. And they began to infiltrate many of the regiments scattered all over India, but particularly in Punjab and UP. Meanwhile, in North America, another of Savarkar's followers, Lala Hardayal, began to organize the Sikhs who were living, most of them in the California or in Canada. into what would be known as the Ghadarites. And they began to plan for a major uprising in India in early 1915. And they put together a lot of effort into this. Regiments were primed, they were all ready to get go. It's somewhere in February of 1915. And the plan was that revolt would first start in India and then it would spread into the Indian regiments which had been deployed by the British across the world. But just a few days before this revolt was supposed to take place, one of the conspirators switched sides and informed British intelligence. And as a result, overnight, all the guards at the armories were changed from Indian guards to European guards. As a result of which, this revolt simply fell apart. Only in Singapore there was a revolt, and for about a week or so, Indian troops held Singapore, but ultimately they were put down. Raj Bihari Bose then escaped to Japan. Many of the others were caught. Sachindranath Sanyal was also arrested, and he was a few months later sent off to also to Port Blair. But that was not the end of it. This network had already been created, and they now got in touch with the Germans. And under the leadership of Bagha Jotin and another network called the Jugantar network, they began to now train large numbers of Indian youth, particularly in Bengal, in how to use guns. And the idea was that the Germans would buy about a large number of rifles, and they did purchase a large number of rifles in North America, which hadn't, by the way, America hadn't yet joined the war. And the idea was to take a shipload of these, about 30,000 rifles, through the Pacific, through Indonesia, and land them on the Odisha coast, where the idea was that you would take these rifles, distributed among these trained youth, and on Christmas Day, when all the top officials were meeting in the Governor General's house in Kolkata, there would be a mass uprising. Unfortunately, what happened is that, again, the key German agent in Singapore switched sides and informed the British. And so this assignment of these ships with these arms assignments were intercepted, and they never reached. Bagha Jotin, of course, did not know this, and he arrived at Balasore coast in Odisha, and he was waiting for this when he was surrounded and, of course, ultimately killed. So this attempt too did not work. Now the Germans supported yet another revolutionary group led by Raja Mahendra Singh and Maulana Barkatullah. And they made their way from Istanbul through Iran to Kabul, where they tried to encourage the Afghans to invade through the northeast, while whatever was remaining of the Ghadarites could again rise and revolt. This effort also failed. Now somebody may take the view that, these were just such impossible plans that they were almost guaranteed to fail. But this is not quite true. Similar plans actually did succeed in many other places. People forget that the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 was a very similar plot by the Germans to go against the Russians. And it succeeded. I mean, it was the Germans who got Lenin in a closed train to come through Germany, through Sweden and Finland, and reach St. Petersburg. It was no more an outlandish plan than what they were trying to do in India, and that succeeded. The British did something similar with the Arabs against the Turks with the Lawrence of Arabia. Many of you will, even if you haven't read the history, you may have at least seen the movie, and you will see that they did something very similar. So these plans of the Ghadarites were not at all as outlandish as many people now try to make it out to be. But yes, it is true, they failed. And then the war in 1919 came to an end. The Allies, of course, won. And then all these soldiers, Indian soldiers who had been deployed in Europe in particular, but in other places as well, began to come home. But remember, the British were very well aware that these same troops had been heavily indoctrinated before they had gone out by Ghadarite ideas. And they discovered that many of the remaining revolutionaries were beginning to make contact with these returning troops. And remember, these are trained troops and they are war veterans, so doubly dangerous. This is the context in which the Rowlatt Acts were put in place. And it is the pushback against the Rowlatt Acts that ultimately resulted in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Again, notice that the Jallianwala Bagh massacre was very much related to the revolutionaries and to the Gadarite movement. It did not happen out of context. This is the context in which it has happened. So you have to understand the revolutionary movement if you want to understand Jallianwala Bagh. And as a result of Jallianwala Bagh, of course, it then gathered pace into the non-cooperation movement, which was of course led by Mahatma Gandhi and was famously a non-violent movement. In the middle of it, that all, as a peace gesture, the British released a large number of the revolutionaries who had been incarcerated in Port Blair, which included Barin Ghosh and Sachindranath Sanyal, although Veer Savarkar was still considered way too dangerous to be released. So many of these revolutionaries came back to India and they also participated in this non-cooperation movement. Unfortunately, as you know, the movement was abruptly stopped after the Chauri Chaura incident. And many of the revolutionaries felt very, very let down by this. So they began to again regroup into an armed movement. And this is when Sachindranath Sanyal, who had of course who had not participated in the cooperation movement because he had been from the beginning quite suspicious of it, he then organized this group into the Hindustan Republican Association and underneath the Hindustan Republican Army. So you suddenly had a new movement. And by the way, the name Hindustan Republican Army is not coincidental. It is very much named after the Irish Republican Army. So you have to remember that all of this is not happening in isolation. It is happening very much as a part of what was going on. It had very much derived from the links of these revolutionaries to the Irish, and earlier, as you saw, to the Germans, and of course with Rash Bihari Bose in Tokyo with the Japanese. All of this is important to the story that I will later come to. Now, many things happened through the 20s with the Hindustan Republican Association, including the Kakodi case, the killing of Saunders in order to avenge the murder of Lala Lajpat Rai, and so on and so forth. There were many, many episodes. But while all of this was going on with the revolutionaries, within the Congress there was an upheaval and there was a split for a while, with Motilal Nehru and C.R. Das splitting away to form initially a party but later on a faction in the Congress party. And C.R. Das at that time recruited a young lieutenant, Netaji, not then known as Netaji, Subhash Chandra Bose. And Subhash Chandra Bose began to also create his own networks. And one of the networks he created was within this revolutionary movement in Bengal, known as the Bengal Volunteers. Now, the Bengal Volunteers, again, is a story that has also almost been forgotten. It is also a story that Netaji did not suddenly sort of opt for the revolutionaries after his, in the late 30s when he had been evicted from the Congress, but in fact had a very close link to the revolutionaries from the very beginning. And in fact, it is the Bengal Volunteers who carried out several acts of armed resistance in the subsequent years. So those of you who are familiar with Kolkata will know the name BBD Bagh, which is what the central business district of Kolkata is called. It's named after Binoy Badal Dinesh. They were three revolutionaries who had attacked Writers' Building around 1930, and they were Bengal Volunteers members. So although Subhash Bose, in public at least, kept his links to the revolutionaries relatively controlled, he was very much in touch and in links with this group. And in the 1930s, he began to build up and encourage many of these groups to join the Congress party. By this time, you have to remember, some part of the revolutionary movement had become taken on Marxist or at least socialist ideologies. This had got to do, incidentally, with a gentleman called M.N. Roy, again barely remembered these days. But M.N. Roy had been Bagha Jyotin's deputy who had been sent to Indonesia to keep track of that arms consignment that was supposed to land in Odisha. But M.N. Roy was now stuck in Indonesia, and he had a very adventurous life, and he ended up in Mexico, where he helped found the Mexican Communist Party, and then he, after many further adventures, ended up in Tashkent, where he would set up the Communist Party of India. And then he would come back to India in the late 20s or 30s. And so there was one group which was linked to M.N. Roy, although M.N. Roy himself would leave the communist movement. This was one group. There were, of course, the old nationalist revolutionaries who were still around, and they combined together to support Netaji. So this is the story of how Netaji himself rose very rapidly in the Congress Party, and as I said, this idea that the Congress Party was only about the Gandhian non-violence is wrong, because the revolutionaries were very much a part of the Congress Party throughout this process, going back to Sri Aurobindo himself. Now, of course, everybody knows the history of what happened with the election of Subhash Bose as the president of the Congress Party, how he had great difficulty working with the Gandhian establishment of the party, and of course was pushed out. I'm not going to repeat this story, but subsequent to that, he then formed a subgroup within the Congress called the Forward Bloc, which was not a separate party, later became a separate party. But more importantly, for our purposes here, he re-established contacts with many of the old revolutionaries. And remember, they could already feel by 1938 that a second world war was approaching. And so he was in touch very much with Rash Bihari Bose and with Sachindranath Sanyal, who were, by the way, already beginning to plan for a second run of the Gadarite movement. And they were activating all their links in Germany, in Japan, and many other places, and of course within India as well. And so this is the context you have to remember. You have to also remember that just a few days before Netaji escaped from his house in Elgin Road, he also met Veer Savarkar. Why is this important? Because it is again important to remember back to the original plan of creating a large insurrection in the British Indian Army. And of course, that is exactly what happened once in 1942 when Singapore fell to the Japanese. And who formed the INA? Well, again, it was Rash Bihari Bose, the old freedom fighter who had attempted to do exactly this in the First World War. So this is the reason you have to remember. This was an attempt that had been going on for quite some time, and when the INA was formed in Singapore, they were essentially carrying out something they had been attempting to do for several decades by this point in time. Now again, I do not need to tell you the story of what happened with the INA, what happened in the Burma campaign and so on. And of course, it all unwound. In military terms, there is no doubt that the INA was indeed a failure. The Japanese lost the war. The INA was in retreat. Many of its key members died during the retreat or were captured, and so on and so forth. However, the original revolutionary plan of an insurrection did happen. And for that, you have to remember what happens next. When the soldiers of the INA were brought to Delhi for trial, and of course they were put up in Lal Killa for trial, there was an absolute buzz across the country. And it didn't only happen in the general population, but also happened in the armed forces. They were amazed to hear about the stories that were coming through and were being publicized as a result of this trial. And in some ways, this trial was a major strategic mistake of the British, because they, in a sense, publicized the whole episode. And it led to a lot of disgruntlement. And this disgruntlement began to rapidly spread through the Indian Armed Forces. And one of the places where it spread was the Indian Navy. So in 1946, in Mumbai, there was a massive revolt in the Royal Indian Navy. Some 20,000 sailors, and remember, these sailors are war veterans. They captured some 80 odd ships in Bombay Harbour. And they declared freedom. And when they did so, there were similar revolts in Karachi, in Kolkata, and many other places. And when the airmen of the Royal Indian Air Force were asked to take action against them, the British suddenly found that they were very, very reluctant. The same was true of many of the army regiments. And there was a genuine fear when this revolt happened in 1946 that there would be a much more generalized revolt. And that is the context, ladies and gentlemen, when the British decided to leave India. So ultimately, the revolutionaries succeeded. And if you see the tale as told from the perspective of the revolutionaries, you can see that it was not a matter of suddenly, opportunistically, Subhash Bose deciding to take advantage of the fascists or a suddenly newly found love for Japanese imperialism, which some of his critics tend to suggest. Far from it. When you see it in the context of the longer revolutionary movement, its links to Germany in the First World War, Raj Bihari Bose's long stay in Japan, the long and repeated efforts to cause an insurrection in the British Indian Armed Forces, then you understand that what Netaji was trying to do was basically trying to get an old dream of the revolutionaries to come to fruition. And guess what? They ultimately succeeded. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Jai Hind.
I'll compliment you on a scintillating and a very moving presentation. May I just add one thing? Apart from the Indian soldiers from the Punjab who were in France and influenced very much by the French revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity who came back to Punjab, there was also the Bengal regiment in Mesopotamia where Qazi Nazrul Islam served, and they also got influenced by notions of independence for India, and the regiment was disbanded by the British. And these Bengali troops, and which very few of us in Delhi know about, they came back to Bengal and they were very influential in stirring up, and they interacted with the Bengal revolutionaries. Qazi Nazrul's poems were also very emotionally important for all the people whom you have mentioned. But this is sadly one aspect again of Indian history which has been blacklisted from our books.
Absolutely, you're totally right that I obviously shortened the story, but this is absolutely
true. And may I sadly add that after the disbandment of the Bengal regiment, the Indian Army never has had a Bengal regiment. This is another shocking instance of how independent India dealt with its past. Except, I'll add one before my army friends start shooting me down.
There is a Bengal Sappers.
Yeah, no. The Bengal Sappers had nothing to do with it. They were in Roorkee, there were very few. The great Karyappa allowed recruitment of Bengalis in one battalion of the Rajput regiment. That's the only exception. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Outstanding, Mr. Sanyal, very impressive. I'm a biographer of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. I wrote a book called The Man India Missed the Most, and my most recent book is the biography of Lala Hardayal called The Great Indian Genius. The reason I'm so impressed with your speech is because you bring clarity to the history that this country was never told. We fought 3 wars of independence: 1857, the Ghadar Party movement, and Indian National Army. And we eventually won our freedom because of 3 wars. There was a multi-layered history and there was a Quit India movement, but that didn't impact the imperial mind. I just want to add 2 more things. In these 3 wars, there were 2 things that were common. One was gender equality. Rani Lakshmibai fought in 1857. Women were part of the Ghadar Party, and Netaji's INA still has a soldier sitting right here. Second point, all the 3 wars we fought for freedom, 1857 Ghadar Party and the Indian National Army, had the complete unity among all the communities of this country. Every religion fought for this country. That was the unique point of our freedom movement. We don't highlight that. History needs to be rewritten, and it needs to be rewritten now. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a gentleman in blue in the back.
जी भारत को अपने इतिहास फिर से लिखना चाहिए, लेकिन कब लिखेंगे हम? 6 साल हो गए इस सरकार को। एक कंट्रोवर्सी हुई थी दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी में, जो फेमस बुक है मॉडर्न हिस्ट्री की, उसको एक न्यूज़ चैनल ने उठाया था कि उसमें भगत सिंह और उनके साथियों को टेररिस्ट कहा गया है। उस किताब को आनन फानन में वापस लिया गया और वो किताब फिर से वापस आ रही है। यानी आपके पास अल्टरनेट नहीं है। 6 साल हो गए हैं, सेंट्रल यूनिवर्सिटीज़ में जो बीसीज को लेकर है वो डिफरेंट विवाद जारी है। अब होगा कब? आफ्टर ऑल न्यू जो एजुकेशन पॉलिसी है वो स्टेट को ही लागू करनी है। अब राज्यसभा में धीमे धीमे संख्या घटेगी क्योंकि स्टेट हाथ से निकल रहे हैं। फिर जैसे ही इतिहास में लिखने की कोई भी बारी आती है, जो अपोजिशन में जो भी पार्टियां हैं वो तुरंत एक आरोप लगाने लगती हैं। तो आप कब लिखेंगे? 6 साल हो चुके हैं।
So I am not a representative of any political party, so I cannot answer for that. But as many of you know, I have been arguing for rewriting this. But let me also say that it requires, one of the things I will say, it requires that a lot of work is done into actually creating the primary material. See, there is no point in replacing rubbish with some more new rubbish. So this is actually hard work, which, by the way, I would be very pleased if you can also join the movement, because one of the things I am at least attempting to do is to actually begin writing all of these things down. Unless you create the primary material based on primary evidence. I know there was debate, for example, on the Aryan invasion theory also. Quite absurd anymore, given the evidence. But the fact is, while the papers have been written, whether it's genetics, archaeology, now there's more than adequate archaeological evidence to show that this whole Aryan invasion thing is utter rubbish. But somebody has to sit down and actually write the alternative story. In the end, remember, false narratives are not replaced by criticism. They are replaced by new narratives. So those new narratives have to be written. And one of the things at least people like me are attempting to do through a lecture like this is to at least get this new narrative out there. The changing of the textbooks is not the beginning, it is actually the end process of the creation of the new narrative, when the new narrative is taught. But the new writing of the new narrative itself takes effort, and we are not, I'm afraid, putting up enough effort into this. But since you have raised the issue, please take up one section of Indian history and simply look at the evidence and rewrite it. I will be very, very pleased to take it on and publicize it, and who knows, in not too much time we will even put it in the textbooks.
There are some students there.
There is a student here, yes.
Sir, what was the benefit of activating groups in foreign countries to India?
So remember, India at that time was obviously under British rule. So there are many things you couldn't do. If you were in British territory, you would just get arrested, hanged, sent off to jail or whatever it is. So by creating these networks across the world, you were able to write books, get them published, you could raise money, you could publicize the Indian cause internationally, create links with other people who were trying to do the same thing. For example, the Indians had very close links with the Irish. And during the wars with the Japanese in the Second World War and with the Germans in the First World War. So these were very, very critical things to do. You remember, the Indian revolutionary movement, or more widely the independence movement, was not functioning in a vacuum. It is functioning in a real world where there are real world currents, many of which are international currents. If you do not engage with them and try to do things in isolation, then likelihood is that you will fail. So, just like we do today, I mean, we have to engage with the rest of the world on economics or geopolitics. In the same reason, the revolutionaries too engaged with their world as it stood at that point in time.
Sanjeev, thanks for the insights. As a mother of an 11-year-old child, I would just like to know what happened to INA after independence. The story of Moni Baba and the others in UP, what happened? Is it in intelligence, or like the gentleman said, that it's still continuing just with history, and it was after independence everything was over?
Well, the specific case of what happened to Netaji is of course a hugely controversial topic. I'm sure we can do several sessions and many movies around it. It is no doubt that the official line that he died in that plane crash, that story has many holes in it, but everything afterwards, all the theories after that are all based on very circumstantial evidence. Now, some of them may be slightly stronger evidence of him escaping, for example, to Soviet Union. Maybe that's true, but it's circumstantial evidence. There is some evidence that maybe he came back to India and he was Gumnami Baba and so on. Maybe it's true, but I don't have any particularly strong view on it. I have, to be fair, not even looked very strongly into the data of these issues. I will leave it purely to say that it is certainly the official story of the crash has many, many holes in it. Beyond that, I don't really have a particularly strong view. But as far as the remaining members of the INA are concerned, and also of the revolutionary movement and of the Indian Navy, the sailors who participated in the naval revolt, for the most part, they were treated rather shabbily by independent India. Now, the odd person, individual, may have been, benefited after independence, but for the most part, they were not. Independent India did not take back, for example, the INA soldiers into the army, and it is only, I think, just 2 years ago that the veterans ultimately participated in the Republic Day parade, if I am not mistaken. As far as the same thing happened incidentally to those who revolted and participated in the naval revolt of 1946. They were not taken back into the Navy. Many of them died in desperate poverty. Very, very late, I think in the 90s, some of them were recognized as freedom fighters. Same thing happened to the revolutionaries. The revolutionaries were considered somewhat of a political threat by those who came to power after independence. A few of them did prosper or at least join the mainstream. Interestingly, Raja Mahendra Singh did join the Congress and he became an MP. And if I am not mistaken, in his first election, 1952, the person he defeated was Atal Bihari Vajpayee. But somebody else could confirm this.
1957.
1957? Okay. Mahendra Pratap Singh, yes. Now, of course, the very major leaders of the revolutionary movement like Raj Bihari, Sachin Sanyal, Chandrasekhar Azad, etc., the bulk of them had actually been killed or a few had died of natural causes by the time India became independent. So most of the big leaders of that movement didn't survive to see Indian independence, but two did. Sri Aurobindo and Savarkar, those who had started it all, of course, they were very old by the time India became independent, but they had survived to see it. But in both cases, they had kind of drifted away from the revolutionary movement. One of them had gone into spirituality, another into more social causes. So in a sense, the revolutionary movement itself sort of got scattered. Few joined the Congress. One branch of it ended up in the communists, and another branch ended up on the right. Various branches of them have survived. Some of those branches have merged with the Jan Sangh and the Bharatiya Janata Party and so on. But the revolutionaries consequently exist to this day, but not in as a movement, but as scattered across the entire political spectrum of India.
Thanks, Sanjeev, for an excellent and a very enlightening lecture. But more importantly, I entirely agree with you that a myth cannot be replaced with a myth, but with a matter. Whether it is just prior to the independence or post-independence also, lot of myth has been perpetuated, and the more and more myths are being perpetuated, the matter is getting lost, and the evidentiary background of these matters are also getting lost. I will make no mistake in this that is it not a race against time? Because the more and more we lose the time. I have written a book called Myth of Hindu Terror. A Hindu terror myth was perpetuated and tried to be placed right from the connection with the Abhinav Bharat, which became defunct in 1953 and was revived through various suspicious sources in 2005, and from there the myth of Hindu terror flows. I am looking to find material on the entire myth of Sikh militancy, because a community which has produced one of the finest warriors in 1971 war, they won the 1971 war for you, had in 6 to 7 years turned into a discredited militant community. This is also a myth which has been perpetuated. I have some links to that, but I am not getting the real evidences authentic on which I can prove this point. The hypothesis is right, but to validate it I require a million more. So are we not, see, in 40 years we have already lost a lot of material. Are we not in a race against time to really bring the facts? See, Rakhi Gadi and other recent Bagpat excavations are reinforcing certain facts which has been wrongly perpetuated, myth has been perpetuated against the matter in the Mahabharata and previous ancient Indian history. But post-independence era also lot of myth in place of matter has been perpetuated.
So you are absolutely right that, it's not just, the purpose of this lecture was to focus on a particular period. But you're right, not just before, it's not history, but even post-independence history also needs to be revisited. Incidentally, since you asked me about the Khalistani movement, let me tell you there is a very strong link between the Khalistani movement and that story I just told you. You see, the Ghadar movement had a very strong Sikh element, and in particular, it was very strongly based out of Canada. And the British, when they faced with this, they invested an enormous amount of effort, energy, and secret service resources to begin to indoctrinate these Ghadarite Sikhs in North America, particularly in Canada. And it is quite interesting, they funded gurudwaras, literature, and individuals in order to try and propagate anti-Hindu ideas amongst the Sikhs and try to separate them up as a religion. And a lot of this evidence of this, incidentally, is still available. I'm happy to provide that, but in many ways, the origin of the Khalistani movement should actually be first looked at from the British attempt to infiltrate the Ghadarites in the 1915 to 1920 period. And in fact, there was an enormous amount of turmoil in the Sikh community at that time as a result of this British infiltration. In fact, there were gun shootouts amongst the Sikhs in North America and so on this issue. And this is the reason why, to this day, there is this strong Khalistani movement in Canada. It is directly related to the British attempt to stamp out nationalistic Sikhs in Canada at that time. So, if you must look at this, you must go back that far.
Sanjeev,
So you can-
one
Yeah.
legendary revolutionary, Trilokanath Chakraborty, also called Maharaj, who spent 31 years in jail. He was, I think, only Indian revolutionary who was sentenced to Burma, then Andaman, like that, And he was also imprisoned by the Pakistani government. He refused to leave Pakistan. And he wrote a autobiography called Ekrish Bochor Jele. I think, and he writes about his links. He mentions visiting all these places where Rajbihari Bose used to visit, Sachin Sarnal, Subhash Chandra Bose and all. But nothing much is known about him. This is one dimension which needs to be explored. I've been talking about this the last few years.
I know. So
Yeah.
what you need to do is to write a good thriller based on his life, and I'm sure Bollywood would love to make a movie about it, because he really had a thrilling life. And in fact, one of the interesting things about these characters is that as I read about them, it's absolutely fascinating how the lives they led. Quite purely from, never mind the interest we have in nationalistic or patriotic interest we have in them. Purely as lives, they were so interesting as characters. They were, they were spies, and they were participating in world events in all kinds of ways, and they were carrying out assassinations. They were, smuggling things. They were really interesting characters, and they were not old. Many of them were just in their late teens, in their 20s, when they were doing some of these things. So I would argue that some of their lives, and I'm putting together material for a book, as you can tell, some of you, but just reading about their lives is so interesting. I mean, Raj Bihari Bose alone is such an interesting character. He spent a lot of time in Japan. He married a Japanese lady, and he earned a living, by the way, by running an Indian restaurant in Tokyo. And that restaurant, although the original building was bombed during the Second World War, that restaurant still exists. And you can still go there and have the original Raj Bihari Bose chicken curry recipe, which I have eaten. So much of this history is not entirely dead, as I can say. The Khalistani movement is a result of this.
What's the name of the restaurant?
I think it's called Nakamuriya. Yes, the name of the place or the restaurant, I forget. But you can Google it up. I don't remember off the top of my head. But, there are scatterings of this history all over. One of my granduncles, Sachindranath Sanyal, had been part of an attempt to throw a bomb on Lord Hardinge in Chandni Chowk, which is right next to Parathe Wale Gali, which I visit quite often. And it's quite amusing for me to go there and have this, and to think about the fact that I currently work in an office which was built by Lord Hardinge. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.